We're Dongbeir. We don't say 人, we say 儿. We don't say 很, we say 贼. We don't say 臭美, we say 嘚瑟. We don't say 我, we say 俺. We don't say 又丑又老, we say 老么卡哧眼儿. We don't say 很多, we say 老鼻子. We don't say 那个地方, we say 那嘎达. We don't say Karen, we say 切尔登. We're Dongbei. If you've ever been to Dongbei, there may be some words and phrases that confuse you. You may think, this isn't what I learned in my Mandarin class. And you'd be right. So today I'm going to teach you 7 key words and phrases that will help you decipher exactly what Dongbei people mean. And by the way, this is part 2 of my Dongbeihua series, so if you haven't seen the first video, please click here. 那我们开始吧. So the first word you need to know is that instead of 什么, Dongbei people will say 啥 or 哈. Instead of 什么意思, Dongbei people will say 啥意思呀? 啥意思呀? So 啥 is a northern word in general, and you may hear it in Beijing and some other cities and areas in northern China, but Dongbeiren really like to use this 啥. Every single time they're supposed to say 什么, they pretty much don't say 什么. It's 啥this, 啥that. Here's some common ways you might hear 啥 in Dongbei people's conversations. 我没啥主意，我没啥可干的。这啥呀？你啥时候到啊？ After the word 干, which means to do, Dongbei people will often turn 啥 into 哈, as in 你干哈呀？你干哈呀？ And they won't even say 你干哈. They'll just cut off the n at the end of 干 and just say 你干哈呀？你干哈呢你? Like very casual, common, kind of hillbilly. And I'll probably say the word hillbilly many times in this video, but you get my drift. Number 2, a word that I use so often. So kind of like how 啥 is an abbreviation for 什么, 咋 is an abbreviation for 怎么. So you may hear it in phrases such as, instead of 怎么办, 咋办呢? 咋办呢? Instead of 怎么了, as in you're concerned about someone or something, you'll say 咋了? 咋了? 咋回事啊? And instead of saying 怎么走, as in how to get there, you'll say 咋走啊? 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 So, number 3, Dongbei people don't like to say 很 or 特别. They like to say 贼 or 贼啦. So, if they want to emphasize how something is very strongly something, like this thing is very delicious or this thing is very ugly, they'll say 这贼啦好吃 or 这贼好吃 or 这贼啦丑 这贼丑. Like they'll use 贼 and 贼啦very often. And the thing about 贼, as if you know 普通话, 贼 is actually the character for thief. So in Dongbeihua, 贼 something actually kind of refers to like it is so much something that it is almost too much. So in a good way, but almost in a bad way. Like when something is like too delicious, you might be considering like, is it too delicious? Is it so delicious that I'm going to become addicted? It's kind of like that feeling. 贼啦好. It's like, it's almost too good. Kind of like that feeling. Another modifier used commonly in Dongbeihua is the word 老. 老 normally means old, but in Dongbeihua, 老 just means kind of emphasizing how much something is, similar to 贼, but not as, I would say, excessive. So some common ways you might hear 老 as a modifier is 刘四老爱凑热闹了. 刘四老爱凑热闹了. So 刘四, the person, loves to basically get in on the action, kind of see where the action is. 老爱凑热闹. So this is basically an adverb modifying 爱, 老爱. a lot. He really loves to do something. And number 4, very commonly used verb in Dongbeihua. Instead of 做, 干, 弄, 办, we'll say 整. So 整 can be to get, to make, to do, a lot of different ways to use 整. It is the all-purpose verb in Dongbeihua. Instead of saying 怎么办呢, which makes you sound more like a Beijing person or like a regular 普通话 speaker, you say 这可咋整啊?这可咋整啊? What do I do about this? How do I fix this? In 普通话 it would be something like 这个怎么办呢?这个怎么办呢? In 东北话 we would say 这可咋整啊?这可咋整啊? If you want to eat something, you would say 给我整点饭吃,给我整点东西吃,你给我整点这个,给我整点那个,整点这个,整点那个. So another way you can use it is if something is giving you trouble, you say 你可别给我整事啊,你可别给我整事. So 整事 or 整事情,整事 in 东北话 is making trouble for somebody. So 你可别给我整事啊,你可别给我整事. So 整 is basically to do, to make, to get, all of these and more. The all-purpose verb in 东北话, 整. Number 5, instead of saying 地方 or 这里, we would say 旮瘩, 旮瘩. So instead of saying 这里, we would say 这旮瘩. Instead of saying 这里, we would say 这旮瘩. So ways you might hear 旮瘩 in conversation is instead of saying 你是哪里人,你是哪里人, you will hear 你是哪旮瘩的,你是哪旮瘩的, which means where are you from? Instead of saying 我们那里, like where we're from, 我们那里, we would say 俺们那旮瘩. And number 6, you probably heard me say this many times already in this video. Instead of saying 我, a lot of Dongbei people will say 俺. Instead of saying 我们, they'll say 俺们. Not all Dongbei people will say 俺们. I actually don't have a habit of saying 俺们, but there are tons of Dongbei people who do say 俺. And I like to, mention something here that's funny because 俺们is actually a word that comes from Shandong. And some of you may not be aware if you're not familiar with a Chinese history, but back in the late, I would say 1800s, there were a lot of starvation in the Shandong area. Basically, there was not a lot of crops to be kind of grown, and the area became kind of an area where people were really starving, to be honest. So a lot of Shandong people went up to the Northeast, which was not really very kind of inhabited at that time. And it is something called 闯关东. So Guangdong was the name of the Northeastern area. And my mom's side of the family, my mom's mom, they went to the Northeast from Shandong to basically have a better life. And a lot of them brought this 俺们 from Shandong up to Northeast. And so now, normally, when you say 俺, people assume that you're from Dongbei. But to be honest, my dad's side of the family, who is still in Shandong, they never went to the Northeast. They say 俺们 very often. Man, this 俺really has a, what is that called? A vocal fry. Like, I noticed people mention that like Chinese has vocal fry for tone 3, but it's never been as strong as when I say 俺. I feel 俺is, I'm literally like breaking my throat trying to say 俺. It's such a low sound. So please let me know in the comments if you feel the same way. So ways you might hear 俺 would be 俺爹, which would be my dad, 我爸, 俺家, 我家, my family. And 7, and the final word that you need to know that Dongbei people love to use is the word 大. You might be confused. 大 is just a normal adjective meaning large. Why do Dongbei people like to use it? Well, you may have heard the stereotype that Dongbei people are big, brash, and loud. Basically, everything can be big. So instead of saying 白菜, we'll say 大白菜. Instead of saying 白天, we'll say 大白天. Instead of saying 兄弟, we'll say 大兄弟. Instead of saying 包子, we'll say 大包子. Instead of saying 脚, we'll say 大脚丫子. The phonetics and phonology of Dongbeihua are really similar to Putonghua. But if you notice some key things from this video, you can easily tell if someone is from Dongbei. Or if you want to imitate Dongbei accent, this guide will help you a lot. First, we're going to look at initial consonants or 声母. The initial consonant R is often not used in Dongbeihua, and it can be replaced by Y, L, or N. So you might have heard this before. Instead of saying 东北人, a lot of times we'll say 东北人. But because Dongbei has a lot of erhua, we'll say 东北儿, 东北儿. So instead of 人, we turned it into yin and then added erhua sound. So 东北儿. There are some Dongbei people, instead of saying 吃肉 with an R, they'll turn the R into a Y. So they say 吃肉, 吃肉, 吃肉. Although this is more of a kind of, farmer stereotype, because, educated Dongbei people will not make this mistake. But there are still some farmers, people who have not really been educated, they will say this kind of pronunciation. And another thing I say specifically in my daily life is with a specific word, the word 扔. So 扔 means to throw. 扔, so you would say 扔垃圾, to throw out the trash, throw out the trash. So instead of taking out the trash in Chinese, we would say 扔垃圾. Okay? And I grew up saying 扔垃圾. I think the R sound can be a difficult sound to pronounce, even for native speakers. So if your tongue is lazy, a lot of times you'll replace the R that is a bit more difficult to pronounce with something easier, like an L or a Y. Another thing that you'll see in more countryside folk is adding the N sound to the beginning of open vowels. So instead of saying 饿了, you would say 饿了. Instead of saying 棉袄, you would say 棉袄, 棉袄. And then there are just some unsystematic initial or 声母 changes that don't really apply to the dialect as a whole, but just sometimes in certain words, it just manifests. For example, instead of 同胞, some Dongbei people will say 同胞. Instead of saying 刹那, some Dongbei people will say 刹那. Instead of saying 尾巴, some Dongbei people will say 尾巴. So just something to be aware of. Next, moving on to 韵母, or syllable final. So this includes the vowel, and if there is a final consonant, that is all 韵母. So this is something that I would say a lot of Dongbei people do, including myself, replacing O sounds with E sounds. So the O sound in Chinese is a bit unique. So for example, 破, it normally means broken. But as you can see, it requires a bit of a rounding of the mouth, 破, right? And so it's a bit more difficult to pronounce. So in Dongbei, we often don't pronounce the entire O sound. We kind of flatten it and say 破. So when I was younger, instead of saying 我衣服破了, my clothes are torn, I would just say 衣服破了, 衣服破了. It's just kind of a lazy mouth. And so I would say, when you are saying things quickly, you're kind of like big and brash, like Dongbei people are known to be, we would say 破了 instead of 破了. Instead of saying 胳膊, 胳膊, which is a bit harder to say, we say 胳膊, 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 right? Easier to say 啵 than 波, right? Another thing that happens to 韵母, but only certain people, instead of saying 约, it'll be replaced with 腰. Now I'm not sure about this one because this one is replacing a shorter sound with a longer sound, so maybe not so much of a lazy thing, maybe just more of a countryside kind of habit. So instead of saying 好好学习, some Dongbei people will say 好好学习. Instead of saying 觉得, some Dongbei people will say 觉得. So similar with the initials, there are some word finals that just have some inconsistent changes. So instead of 剥皮, to cut, to trim the skin off of fruit, 剥皮, a lot of Dongbei people will say 剥皮. And this goes back kind of like to the O sound being turned into sound. So as you can see, Dongbei people will love the sound. Instead of saying 厉害, 你真厉害, a lot of Dongbei people will say 你真厉害. 烈 instead of 厉 will say 烈. Instead of 塑料, Dongbei people might say 塑料. And personally, I do most of these things. It's kind of just from a young age, these are the pronunciations I heard. So I just grew up thinking that these were the correct ways to pronounce it. And now that I'm older and I learn proper Putonghua, I learn, oh, it's not 塑料, it's 塑料, right? That's something that you learn over time. So now we're going to talk about some tone changes and some kind of the tone patterns of Dongbeihua. There is a unique tone kind of rhythm to Dongbeihua. And what may that be? So there are honestly not a lot of academic papers about this, and I've done a lot of research. And unfortunately, I don't have like a concrete thing to tell you because there's still a lot of debate on what exactly makes the tone unique about Dongbeihua. But I'm going to give you some tidbits that I think are pretty much universally agreed upon. So here are some examples. So the Dongbeihua tone space tends to be a little bit more condensed compared to Putonghua space. So I mentioned in my tones video that my tone 1, 一声, tends to not be a high 5. It tends to be more like a 3 or 4. And I think that might possibly be related to the fact that I grew up speaking Putonghua through Dongbeihua. So what the literature says is that the tone space of Dongbeihua is a bit more compressed. So for example, tone 1 in Putonghua is a 5-5, whereas Dongbeihua is lower, like a 4-4. So there are also some additional tone sandy rules for Dongbeihua. So in Putonghua, we know that when a tone 3 is in front of a tone 3, the first one turns into tone 2, like 你好. Instead of 你好, it's 你好. But for Dongbeihua, there is an additional tone sandy rule. Tone 3 also turns into a tone 2 before a tone 1. So if you have the phrase 好家伙, 好家伙, so 好 is tone 3, 家 is tone 1. In Dongbeihua, we would say 好家伙, 好家伙. So this may not be every single person from Dongbei, but this is kind of like if you're talking about the very countryside Dongbeihua, this tends to happen 好家伙. There is a lot of tone 2 happening in Dongbeihua. Another thing that tends to happen in Dongbeihua is if there is a disyllabic word where it is tone 1 plus tone 4, what normally happens is the first tone turns into tone 2, and then the last word turns into a 轻声or tone 5 or neutral tone. So for example, for 干净, 干净, it is tone 1 plus tone 4. Dongbei people will often say this as 干净, 干净. And I just want to say, not just in this specific situation, I would say tone 4 at the end of a word often turns just into a 轻声, just often, just very, very often. Dongbeihua very much emphasizes a very short and quick and soft neutral sound, and then so the thing in front of it becomes very much stressed. So I mentioned earlier, I said something like 大包子. So this is just kind of like the way that Dongbei people will emphasize something in front of a 轻声 to make it even stronger. So that is a quick introduction into Dongbeihua words, phrases, and phonology. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and leave me a comment in the comments below. And see you next time. 下次见, bye bye.